Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our cross-grantee meeting, Intersections of Justice, Disability, Gender, and Safety. I'm Melissa McGregor with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and I'm going to get us started. So we're here today because women and gender diverse people with disabilities experience some of the highest rates of gender-based violence in Canada, yet their experiences and stories are often overlooked. This issue touches on every part of gender justice work, and it's essential that we come together across sectors and movements. Today is about connection and learning. By sharing perspectives across disability and justice sectors and gender justice sectors, we can strengthen our collective ability to support survivors and build more inclusive, accessible, and trauma-informed practices. I want to start off by acknowledging that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the programs we support take place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We're grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land, and we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship, and an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Some technical details to support your participation today. We have interpreters working to ensure that everybody's words are understood. If you haven't done so already, if you select the globe on the bottom of your screen, you can select English or French to ensure you have a seamless experience with us. We also have captioning available today in English and French, so please visit the chat box to access the links for this service. If you're having any technical issues, please feel free to pop a note in the chat, and we'll do our best to support you. In a few minutes, we'll move into our presentation, and if you have any questions for our speakers, you can put them in the Q&A box. The Q&A box might be a little bit hidden on your screen. If you click on More, you'll find the Q&A box under there, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can. And after we hear from our wonderful keynote speakers, we will move into some breakout rooms, and there'll be 3 rooms for you to choose from, depending on the discussion that you're most interested in. Those groups were shared this morning, but we will share them again in a few minutes. And finally, at the end of our session today, we'll be circulating a survey, and we would really appreciate if you could spend a few minutes before jumping off the call to share your feedback with us to help us inform future events that we host. But before I hand it over to our speakers, I want to get a sense of who's in the room with us. So as I mentioned, this is a cross-grantee session, which means that we have representatives from organizations across all of the funding streams the foundation works with. So that's work in the North, economic development, gender-based violence, youth work, and it's helpful just to get a sense of who's joined us today. So in a moment, I'm going to put up a poll. If you can just take a few minutes to let us know where you're joining from, that would be really helpful. Okay, I'm still seeing some results roll in. If you could give me a few more minutes. Okay. I'll share the results here. You should be able to see them on your screen now. So pretty good representation. We have some folks from the East Coast, lots of folks from Ontario. The prairies are represented. So good scan across the country. For the focus of your work, most people working in gender-based violence and disability justice, which makes sense given the topic we're discussing today. So we do have some folks from youth empowerment sector. So that's great to see. And I think there'll be some other folks joining us too who work in other fields. And then what communities you primarily serve. So working with Black women, girls, trans and two-spirit and non-binary folks, people with disabilities, some folks working with First Nations communities. So a pretty broad span here. And some immigrants and youth, and so good representation of different sectors. So thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, so now I'm excited to introduce our speakers. So first we have Khadija Issa, who is a Somali organizer and a co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of British Columbia, and also serves on the Fraser Health Accessibility Advisory Council, advancing equity within BC's healthcare system. Khadija's work is rooted in accessibility, racial justice, and community power, with a focus on supporting women, gender diverse people, and racialized communities most impacted by systemic harm. Also joining us today is Sarah Jama, who is a co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of BC and the former executive director of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. She holds an undergraduate degree from McMaster University, where she taught an inaugural course called Disability Justice 101. As a Black woman with cerebral palsy and the 2021 winner of the Women of Distinction Award in Hamilton, Ontario, her lived experience shapes her understanding of gender justice and gender-based politics. So I'm happy to pass it over to them for their presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Khadija Issa, and I am one of Disability Justice Network's co-founders. Sarah, I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself.
And my name's Sarah, and I'm super excited to be here with you all today. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, so for who we are community organizers and advocates who are building a world where disabled people are free to be. And what we do is we organize around disability justice because it's essential to our collective liberation. And our framework mainly centers solidarity, collective care, and the leadership of those most impacted.
Next, there we go. So why do we do this work? Canada is sort of stuck in the 1990s when we look at conversations around disability justice and rights. A lot of conversations are stuck around the commodification of access. The idea that accessibility means adding ramps to stores so that we can influence our economic purchasing power and participate in society. But we don't actually look at how systems interact with each other when you look at legislation that currently exists. The Canadians with Disabilities Act only existed in 2019. And that's 20 years behind the Americans with Disabilities Act. When you think about our medical system, our prison industrial complex, our education system, there's not really a way legislatively to interrogate the ways in which people with disabilities are left behind in all of these systems from an intersectional way. And so our work is looking at how do we move beyond asking for our rights, and how do we move toward asking the question, where do we go when the services in place don't actually work for us? And how do we build a society that can work for us, that does interrogate these systems? Khadija?
And so for where we do it, we are established in BC, and we currently reside on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Semi-Amu, Coquitlam, and Coast Salish peoples. And we are witness that they've been stewards of this land since time immemorial. Next slide, please. Okay, Sarah.
I'm going to go to the next slide, actually, and then come back to this one. Sorry. Okay, so how are these movements, when we talk about gender justice and disability justice, connected? On the surface, you can say, yeah, there are women with disabilities that exist, and therefore these systems are connected. But historically, the connections between these movements have been a little bit more infamous. When we look at, for example, the Famous Five, it was a group of 5 women who fought for feminist rights here in Canada. They actually fought for the first woman to be elected onto Senate. And of the Famous Five, you had the first woman elected out here in the West. But the Famous Five were also really responsible for pushing eugenics-based policy here in Canada and paving the way for acts like this Alberta Sterilization Act, where many disabled women and Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized against their will, knowledge, and consent. I'm also thinking about forced institutionalization that happened across Canada of disabled people, where our government decided to create a system that mirrored our Indigenous residential schools, where youth with disabilities, women with disabilities, were taken from their homes and forcibly hospitalized under the guise of receiving care, where they were also physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. So examples I can think of are the Aurelia Asylum of the Idiots and the Feeble-Minded out in Ontario, about 4 hours out from where I was born. If I had been born in the early 50s and 60s, I could have been sent to one of these institutions. Or I'm thinking about the Ross A. McDonald School of the Blind that was also shut down due to egregious behavior of sexual assault that occurred against youth that were forcibly enrolled there. And so across Canada, institutions like this were established, and legislation existed where disabled women, very particularly, did not have autonomy over their body and their ability to, have autonomy in society. I'm going to go to the slide before this one. So we see acts of eugenics-based policy today, and I think this is why this conversation is really important. Sterilization still exists in a form in our current shelter systems where you'll see cases of people with developmental disabilities or Down syndrome being forced to take medication that stops their periods without their knowledge or consent. You see intimacy rules that still exist in long-term care homes because it's seen as too complicated to support facilitating intimacy where folks with disabilities are continuously warehoused. We see examples of this in Trump's Tylenol conversation, where he consistently continues to blame mothers for the fact that children are born with autism and blame mothers for taking the only medication that they're able to take while pregnant. And that's creating a slippery slope of conversations that will continue to potentially criminalize women down the line for birthing disabled children. Disabled people exist, and this conversation around, why they exist and trying to control whether or not they can exist is eugenics based. I'm also thinking about the lack of parental rights that exists in Canada for mothers with disabilities. In America, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, like I said, is about 20 years ahead of us. And there are some states that have legislation that protect the rights of mothers across the US. Here in Canada, we don't have such policies. So oftentimes you'll hear stories of mothers with disabilities who give birth and then have CAS called on them in hospital settings because they're seen as unfit or unable to take care of their child. One of my mentors before she passed away, Ing Wong Ward, who was a producer with CBC in Ontario, she told me, don't consider having a child, even if your partner is able-bodied, unless you have enough money for lawyers. And this is something that a lot of women with disabilities understand and carry with them when they make these decisions. I'm also thinking about gendered social assistance programs. So in Ontario and in BC, if you get married to someone with a disability or someone without a disability, whether or not they're working, affects if you can keep your social assistance rate the same. So essentially making it difficult for people with disabilities to get married without facing financial risk or consequences. And we know that women with disabilities are more likely to experience intimate partner violence, and that includes financial violence as well. And so it's putting women with disabilities in risky situations where to get married, it means losing part of your autonomy. And so there's not a real choice there. Many women with disabilities make the decision to stay single. Sorry, next slide. We can skip forward. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah, for speaking on violence. I'm going to touch on the scope of violence that women with disabilities experience in Canada. In Canada, women with disabilities experience about twice the rate of violence compared to non-disabled women, and this includes physical, sexual, emotional, and economic forms. Just in BC, where we currently reside, 41%. It is 41% versus 22% for non-disabled women, according to Statistics Canada. Community organizations like Dawn Canada estimate that 83% of disabled women will experience sexual or gender-based violence in their lifetime. and this shows up through financial violence, policy, and care systems. We can go, I think, to the next slide. Actually, we can go back. I have my own notes. For financial violence, I think it goes beyond just like intimate violence, and it looks like social assistance rules that Sarah touched on, where women with disabilities sometimes make the hard choice of staying single because when they do get married, they receive support, but it's sanctioned. Um, and then I think, yeah, you can go to the next section. So I'm going to touch on institutional and um, interpersonal harm. Institutional violence is the harm that happens inside systems meant to help, especially in hospitals, care homes, transit, housing, or income programs. It looks like being not accommodated because there's no systems for place for people who have wheelchairs. And it also tells people who have disabilities that their suffering is just a service issue when it's actually institutional harm, and it's often invisible or normalized. 94%, according to StatsCan, 94% of um, intimate, vi- intimate and sexual assaults go unreported. And what we see in numbers is just a fraction of the daily harm and neglect that disabled women face. And so violence against disabled women is not just one category, it's a continuum that runs through relationships, money, institutions, and until we name all of it, we cannot work on ending any of it. Okay, Sarah, do you want to go?
Yep. So examples of obstacles and institutional barriers in terms of systemic harms could be our long-term care system and segregation. So the way the long-term care system works in Canada is many people age out of the workforce and are disabled either through life circumstances or become disabled or are injured on the job over time. It's impossible to go through our workforce through an entire lifespan and not end up with a disability at some point. But rather than supporting people to age at home and in communities, we continue to segregate and warehouse them in long-term care systems where during COVID, especially, we saw that people were sitting in their feces and urine for weeks. In Ontario, there were some long-term care homes where doorknobs were removed from facilities so people couldn't leave. We have people using medical assistance and dying because they don't want to go to long-term care. And the same in Canada, the same systems that create food for prisons are the same systems that are hired to create food for some long-term care homes, especially in Ontario. And so I think that goes to show that the long-term care system is a form of segregation, and there are other ways that we could be supporting people. But disabled people are often placed in long-term care as a way to like separate them from society and continue to keep them isolated because they are no longer useful in the workforce. And now many people are using MAID to escape that. um, Poverty and legislated dependence. So social assistance rates are often below the cost of living. So people are legislated into poverty, chronic poverty and dependence on their caregivers. Many people with disabilities can't work and are forced to stay on social assistance rates and which are below rent costs. So many people I've met have been living in encampments, are actually on social assistance and just can't afford anywhere else to live. This also puts women at risk because it puts them in situations of lack of safety or having to stay in dangerous relationships or situations because the social assistance that they do receive isn't enough to live on.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Sorry,
you
you can continue. No, I was just gonna touch on the social assistance aspect of it. Most times there in Canada, especially just in BC, 62% of disabled people are employed compared to 80% of non-disabled people. And whenever people with disabilities have jobs, their social assistance is clawed back. And so you're stuck in a position where you're not able to work due to chronic conditions. And if you are able to find work, it kind of gets deducted from your social assistance, which makes it hard for people with disabilities. And then, Sarah, you can continue. Sorry. I just had some stats that I wanted to share.
Sounds good. Thank you. I think we can go to the next slide. So I talked about parental rights a little bit and family separation, but people with disabilities are more likely to have child welfare involved in their family situation based on assumptions on competence. I had that also when raising my nephew. I got asked by CAS if I was taking him on a trip because I needed help to travel. And so I had a hard time getting consent in order to take him anywhere, even though I was his main caregiver. And that's just one example. In terms of policing and incarceration, people with disabilities who are racialized and unhoused are overrepresented in our prison system, but also people with developmental disabilities who can get taken advantage of in our incarceration system or not understand fully or consent to the processes that they're engaging with are overrepresented in our prison systems. The Disability Justice Network of Ontario ran a prison solidarity phone line where we spoke to countless numbers of people with developmental disabilities or who were racialized and unhoused, who are continuing to be put through the system, mainly because in part because of their disability. If you're being incarcerated due to being unhoused and you're disabled, oftentimes what happens is you're taken off your medication in jail and you're not given supports in order to get out of living in parks and encampments. And so you're just put back into the street once you're done in the prison system. And it turns into the cycle of living park to jail, park to jail. And so that's contributing heavily to the overrepresentation. And our shelter systems as well contribute to this because many disabled houseless folks are seen as disruptive and are put on lists where they're banned from shelters if they're seen as too disruptive, which is ableist language and policy, where they need support and often they get banned from returning to shelter systems and end up in the parks. So it creates this cycle. And then with MAID and economic pressure, many people are using medical assistance and dying because they can't afford to live at home, revealing systemic neglect rather than true consent and choice. This isn't about being against medical assistance and dying, but it's against the coercion from the state, which is forcing people with disabilities to use MAID under track 2 of MAID because they just don't have any other choice in terms of being able to survive. So getting into the.
Do you want me
Sorry,
to take this on?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, no worries. Sorry. Okay, so the way forward into dependence and collective care, what we do is kind of a reminder that no one is independent and we all rely on one another. And interdependence and care are central to the liberation of all of us and not a sign of weakness. And as Sarah said, most times we eugenics-based policies cause harm not only to disabled people, but to able-bodied people, including mothers. Um, Beyond productivity and value, I think the worth of women with disabilities and people with disabilities is not defined by productivity or economic contribution. True disability justice means dismantling systems that measure values through work, ability, or profit. Most times, I recently spoke to Maid and just the film Life After. I will recommend everybody to watch it. I learned a lot from that. And I think as someone who is navigating a new disability and kind of like working on just unlearning many of the things as I was as an able-bodied person, um, this rings true for me, especially the dismantling systems that value people through work, ability, or profit. Okay, Sarah, I can continue speaking to it, but do you want to take over?
Sure. So another principle of disability justice is access as love and liberation. So accessibility is not just a checklist or an afterthought. It's an act of love, solidarity, and resistance that allows communities to thrive together, and community-led futures. Change has to be led by those most impacted, disabled people, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, racialized, queer, and gender diverse, hold the knowledge and leadership to build safer and freer futures for all. These principles of disability justice were created by Sins Invalid. They're a trans racialized collective out in San Francisco, I think, who tried to create a framework of thinking about disability that wasn't just rights-based, but also was focused on collective dreaming and building futures for disabled people. And so these principles are a mandatory way of looking at the disability justice framework. So we have some discussion questions for folks to think through as we head into our breakout conversations. What resonated with you most from today's conversation? How does ableism, eugenics, and gender-based violence show up in systems or communities that you're a part of? What would care and safety look like if they were designed for disabled survivors? And how can you integrate disability justice principles in your work or daily life?
Thank you so much, Sarah and Khadija, for that presentation. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and a bit of a reality check that I think we tend to think of ourselves as being more progressive than other countries, and we still really have a lot of work to do in Canada, and the conversation has really stalled. So I appreciate you sharing that and like how intersectional it is and how it really impacts every system in society. And we need to be having conversations across sectors to really be making long-term change. Thank you so much. Before we move into breakout rooms, I want to turn it over to the audience and see if we have any questions from folks. Okay, there's a couple in here, so I'll read them out. You talked about how lack of accessibility is framed as a service issue rather than institutional harm. Do you have some simple messaging that people could use to advocate for change within an institution like a women's shelter?
I think in a women's shelter specifically, thinking through what access tangibly means for folks experiencing the most harms. So the example I gave is like disabled people are often, if you're in crisis, kicked out of shelters and banned from shelters. I know in Hamilton, the city I was from, we had an Indigenous woman that was banned for 5 years because she had a crisis while she was in the shelter and she was homeless. So that meant she ended up back in the street with her wheelchair. And so I think thinking through not just how do we make our rooms in the shelter accessible, how do we make our materials accessible, but how do we look at disability justice as a principle of like influencing our policy with the understanding that we're not going to expect people to change how their body functions, what drugs they use, or how they have to survive, or if they're in psychosis. We're not going to expect people to change how their body functions because that's inherently ableist. And so I think that's a framing that can be used in a shelter system is, yeah, not expecting people to change how their body works.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I think even just like that last sentence is really powerful. We can't expect people to change how their body works. Yeah, and really important to think about how like it's more than just building ramps and having bigger rooms, but it's how are staff trained and how are they treating people? How are we interacting with the community? All of that matters just as much or more so. Our second question here is, could you talk about the experience of girls and gender diverse youth with disabilities? What are the specific challenges they are facing and how can organizations better support them?
Khadija, do you want me to, or do you want to take it?
I will rather you take it if that's okay.
Okay. So in terms of girls, I can only speak from like my experience, but I would say for myself and for many young girls, we didn't learn about sexual health or wellness in that sense until our mid-20s to early 30s, and I actually think that's a common experience. There's an organization called Can Child Disability out in Ontario that did some research on this that showed that a lot of young girls with developmental disabilities don't actually get this knowledge until their late 20s to early 30s. But for me, I was actually taken out of gym class in grade 9 because I was told I didn't need the curriculum, but I also missed some health class because of that. So there are systemic ways that young girls are just not given the same academic experience and knowledge around health and wellness and how our bodies function as the average able-bodied person, because we're just assumed to not need health-related materials.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that's a really important piece to make sure that everybody gets the information that they need to live healthy lives. Any other questions from the audience before moving to breakout room? I have a question. It was just, I think in your presentation, you referenced, I think it was a documentary and then also an organization out of San Francisco. Would you mind putting the names of those in the chat for folks?
Yes, I'll just write.
Thank you so much. Oh.
That's the
Okay.
documentary.
So we will get ready to move into breakout rooms. So we have 3 breakout rooms today. We'll put the descriptions in the chat in just a moment. Oh, I have a question here. Can you speak more about the importance of employment and how this can be improved in terms of access?
I think when it comes to employment, something that I have navigated personally is trying to find work that would also work in conjunction with my disability benefits. In terms of improving access, the Canadian government did say that they will come up with a federal funding that would help raise people with disabilities like out of poverty. And a lot of people with disabilities were so excited and had hope, and it turned out to be $200 extra on top of regular disability benefits. A lot of people who are disabled currently live on like provincial benefits, and it does not meet their needs. And so even then there was also like the advocacy from disabled folks on making sure that the federal benefit is not clawed back by provincial governments. So I think especially when it comes to the importance of employment, it kind of it's necessary for people with disabilities to live with dignity without relying on just government funding. But at the same time, a lot of people with disabilities struggle with chronic pain, and it's either or right now, and you cannot have the ability to work and still have access. So I think it's something that I would suggest people to kind of like educate themselves on and kind of learn more, because there's this thought process of people with disabilities are like fully taken care of by government benefits, but that's not the case.
Thank you,
And how
Khadija.
it can be improved is just like able-bodied people and different organizations just kind of like working in collective care with people with disabilities, and like standing in solidarity, and when these bills are being passed, kind of like having them at the table as well. Sarah, if there's anything that I'm missing, please feel free to add to it.
The only thing I would add is that we need to be moving toward a society that isn't trying to force disabled people to get back to work like Doug Ford is doing out in Ontario. Because we know that disabled people often can't work, and that's okay. Like that has to be okay in our rhetoric, in our society. And right now it's not seen as okay or something that we should be proud of. Like some disabled people can't work, and at some point every single able-bodied person won't be able to work anymore, and that should be fine, and that needs to be integrated into our society.
Thank you for that. I think that's absolutely right, that we not everybody's going to work, or people can work. Their ability to work will fluctuate, and we need benefits that are flexible and realistic for people who are living complicated lives. There's one more question here. They say it's amazing to think of accessibility as an act of love. How do we make sure that trauma-informed services include this love? Do you have a small example of ways to build it in?
So when I think about love and disability justice, I think about this term that was created by activists in the States called access intimacy. So it's the idea of a form of love being that able-bodied people can understand without having it be explained to you what someone's access needs actually are. So for me, that looks like when my friends are able to figure out how to fold up my chair without me having to say because they remembered, or they understand that like on the weekends I might need help with changing my bed sheets, just like regular tasks that I don't have to explain. I think on a policy level, it looks like implementing universal design. So how can we create a society where we're building ramps not just for people who need them, who are in wheelchairs, but also for moms with strollers or senior citizens? How are we building a society that works for everyone, that's anticipating the needs that might need to be met without waiting for disabled people to explain them? And so for me, that's an act of love and a form of like real intimacy.
Thank you so much, Sarah.